Welcome to the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. Today we start the day in the Media Center of Reforms, so we are holding a roundtable lessons of wealth. Will Ukraine revive like the Poland did? And it is being supported by International Renaissance Foundation and also the Foundation for Local Democracy. The conversation will be moderated by Anatoly Tkachuk, which will, of course, make the conversation constructive. Thank you. Good morning, dear friends. In Ukraine, for the last half a year, maybe more, there's a lot of talk about the necessity to decentralize, and of course almost all political forces that took part in elections talked about decentralization. Everybody, of course, had their own sense in mind, but the main factor that is undoubtable is that we have to transfer a lot of authority from central bodies of power to the local government. Not once our top officials said that as an example for the conducting of such reform, we should take a Polish experience, because Poland over the last years has achieved a lot of success in the economy and social sphere, and one of the possible deep foundations for such prospects of such fast changes was the reform of decentralization that was one of the first to be held in Poland. That's why very attentively and in detail we inspect Polish experience, and today we have an opportunity to talk to people who were directly engaged in the reform and also who know about the today's state, about the system of administration in Poland. So the people who gathered here are Marcin Swięcicki, head of expert group on self-governance and decentralization reform in Ukraine, a person with a huge experience, the MP and former mayor of Warsaw, Wojciech Misung, who is a professor and advisor to the head of Supreme Chamber of Control of the Republic of Poland, and former Deputy Minister of Finance on local self-government in the government of Leszek Balcerowicz. Of course, there's a lot for him to say. Who goes after whom? Money goes after authority, or authority goes after money, because in Ukraine we still in two minds about this. Andrzej Parawski, director of Bureau of the Association of Polish Cities, Grzegorz Kubalski, expert of the Polish Community Association, and Markian Żelak, coordinator of Polish and Ukrainian Working Group on Decentralization. So these are our Polish partners, and on Ukrainian side, Yuri Hanushak, former MP, an expert who's been studying the issues of local self-government for long, and Pavlo Kozyrev, a long-standing chairman of the Association of Small Cities of Ukraine, a mayor of Ukrainka town. So I think that we shall start from, how this happened, that Poland had immediately started the decentralization reform, why this was needed, what was the situation, and how the political processes led to the fact that the reform was actually conducted but not drawn in words. Good morning, everybody. The reform of self-government was one of the most important reforms that Poland conducted at the very start of political reform. And the political situation was that we had our first non-communist government headed by Tadeusz Mazowiecki, and we got power in Warsaw, but we thought that people in locations should also feel that they are masters of their own lands, and that's why we have to create a high level of self-reliance and autonomy for them, and provide them with an opportunity to act at their own expense. So Grzegorz Rogulski was appointed responsible for self-government. We did not actually know the situation about self-government. Jerzy Rogulski was the only person who knew about this. Probably several more people who knew from Western European experience how self-government works. We were lucky in that Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the premier, said to told those people, you have to prepare this reform from the beginning to end. And they have fastly prepared this reform. The premier has approved of it, then the government, and then the parliament, and within half a year, the laws were ready. And the first level of self-government was introduced at the most important level, the level of community. Then the elections in June 1994 were the elections of councillors to these local self-government bodies, who by that time already had their own money, their own budgets, and this was the first stage of our reform. Then this continued for several years, and second and third levels were introduced because there were arguments about whether we need other administrative levels or we should be satisfied with only communities. So it finished only in 1998, and it was very, very successful. So the local self-government is based on the principles of their own finance, their own property, and the control over self-government should be only according to the legislation, and there is also an opportunity to file appeals to the court if the local self-government's decisions are stopped. Of course, there's a lot of problems even now. For instance, huge cities like Warsaw and adjacent cities, or Upper Śląsk, where there are 14 big cities. There are, the voluntary principles of cooperation between them do not work, but we do not have one single unit of self-government for a huge city that would control both transportation and territorial arrangements. So we have a problem of districts, the problem of a medium level, who would be, for instance, engaged in local public health, but in reality it happens differently. For instance, public health is provided for at the expense of insurance from the nationwide fund. So the activity of districts in this sphere has fallen down, so they don't have many tasks in local self-government. But we also have the problem of small communities. We have 2.5 thousand communities in Poland, and of course we need to create some centers for them that would join several communities as far as given services is concerned. There's also an excess centralization of some services, like for instance community hires teachers, but the payment for teachers and their movement along the ladder is being determined by the ministry, and they actually protect the teachers, and it is very hard to assess the quality of work of teachers, and that's why it helps to preserve the status quo in education. So on the one hand, the reform worked because people started to control the authority, and on the other hand, the local authorities started to be responsible to their communities, and in many villages and towns we see that the authorities are being responsible for the population in that they are making working for the best conditions of life, and the conditions can be changed by the local community. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Martin, thank you for your contribution, but I would like to add why historically Poland needed the decentralization. Jerzy Rogulski has more than once emphasized that centralization in Poland started in 1945-46 by the ruling Socialist and Communist Party supported by Stalin. Until 1939, Poland was a decentralized country. They had huge traditions of local self-governance based on Magdeburg or Hansa legislation. So decentralization was coming back to traditions. And we shall remember that decentralization was carried out by the governments that were created after the victory of Solidarity up to 1997. Those were right-wing and center forces. Thank you. Mr. Martin was talking about fundamental things. They have transferred authority, finance, responsibility, but I'd like to ask Mr. Misung how the Ministry of Finance has agreed to transfer money, and was the money enough so that the gminas started to function at once?
It's not easy with money. Money have such an ability to always lack. But it's important that in the reform of self-government that was held in 1990, it was important to differentiate two things: how much money we had for self-governance, basically how much public money we had, what we had money for and what we didn't. And the second issue was how to allow the self-governance authorities to use the money that they receive. And what was lacking for both self-government and the government in general in Poland was financing. In the difficult situation when we started the reform of self-government, we lacked everything. But when we are moving towards decentralization, that does not add up money. But what was important and what saved self-governance and saved us and allowed Poland to develop quickly was that people believed that communities can independently manage with money. That was the logic and the philosophy. Maybe you don't have enough money, but do what you believe should be done. No restrictions were imposed on the communities. There was little money. The communities wanted to do many things, to improve many things. But what was important was that Professor Rogulski was decisive enough, and they did not allow the ministries to be superior to self-governance, so that they allowed self-governance to manage themselves. If this is the responsibility that you receive, if the citizens come to you because you do not cope with your powers, then think well before you use money. We didn't have enough money. We had to decide ourselves how to use this money. There was not one recipe for all. And that philosophy, that mentality is present there even now, and that is what the self-governance in Poland is based on. I would like to now ask Pavlo. That's an interesting phrase. Everyone can do something with money, but what if you don't have money? They did not add money, but they allowed to use the money that they had. What do you think? Could such a recipe be well perceived in Ukraine? For the first time, I thought that I think alike with the representative of the Ministry of Finance. Unfortunately, the representative of the Ministry of Finance is the representative of a different country. But what Wojciech was talking about, that's what I know very well. You ask, with money or without money? But the representative of Ministry of Finance said correctly, we are spending money now, and we lack money, and we always lack money. That's probably one of the features of money. One thing is that we need to more efficiently use the money per hryvnia or per zloty. We will be able to do more, because those who will be doing it, they are more motivated to spend this hryvnia more efficiently, because the authorities, the local authorities, basically these are people who for themselves are providing services, the services which are provided by the local self-governance. So I don't see any conflict here between what was there in Poland in the beginning of 90s and what we have in the beginning of 2020s, I would say, in Ukraine. We started at the same time, unfortunately, but thank you. We now have the situation when we have territories which have been saying that they are feeding the whole of Ukraine. Now, for more than half a year, they are not feeding Ukraine. And Ukraine has not really felt that it lost the feeder. But at the same time, in the region, they have their own problems. In Poland, there are also different regions. There were old industrial regions there, which could not compete. Which of you could tell us about the situation, how decentralization, how transferring financing helped to improve the situation in these problematic regions, in coal miners regions, in the industrial regions where there was old industry that was collapsing? Andrzej? Such changes of the old and not very efficient system of the country took place in Poland thanks to the common efforts of self-governance and government. You cannot just decentralize the restructuring of industry which were state-owned and which have never been transferred to the level of self-governance. Such decentralization was to take place based on the decisions of the central government. But decentralization allowed to manage people. People were moving to different parts of Poland, and they had the conditions to live in other parts of Poland. They were able to operate there, to find jobs, and that was supported by self-governance. One interesting example, an example which will be difficult to repeat, that's a little town located in the forest, and this was previously the place where the army of Russian Federation stayed, but when they left, this little town was empty, and then they moved the miners from High Silesia, where the mines were closed, but the community where this empty town was located provided jobs for those people who were resettled. Decentralization basically is most often the decentralization of problems. They do not decentralize things which could be addressed at the central level easily. So decentralization did not lead to the situation that Poland is more homogeneous, talking about industry. Poland was always divided into eastern and western parts, and people were saying that the eastern part is less developed. The part which was under Russia in the 19th century. And today these differences are still there. We see the development everywhere in Poland, but this development did not result, even after 20 years of existence in equal conditions, to the reduction of these differences. That's also a lesson. During decentralization, we committed some mistakes, and it would be good if Ukraine did not commit such mistakes. We know that Ukrainian experts remember that, but on the other hand, Ukrainian self-governance also needs to have the right to commit mistakes. Decentralization is about transferring responsibility, but when we transfer the responsibility, we need to transfer the right to commit mistakes. And it will be not the minister, the prime minister, the president who will be reporting about mistakes, but the citizens of this community will be asking about such reports from local authorities. To a certain extent, Poland had a similar situation with the heavy industry in the beginning of 90s, because in Poland, the most developed industries were manufacturing goods for the market of the Soviet Union. These were plants that were manufacturing machine building products, heavy industry, electronics, and all that Soviet market disappeared after the ruble stopped being the exchange currency, and Gorbachev said that the Soviet Union will be trading with the neighbors only in dollars, only in convertible currency, and Soviet companies did not have this convertible currency, and they were not buying from Poland or Czech Republic. They, for this converted money for dollars, they could buy equipment from the U.S. and other countries, and about 100 companies in Poland suddenly lost the Soviet market, and they had to look for other partners for other markets, and they had to change the partners. How was it happening? On the one hand, there was an assistance provided by the government, creating conditions for foreign capital so that it can come and help in restructuring. The conditions were created to develop the small and medium-sized businesses, and many large companies reduced the number of jobs, but people could find jobs in small and medium-sized business. The World Bank got involved, and then the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development started helping in the process of restructuring large industry. Talking about local authorities, they were playing their own role. The local authorities, for example, talking about administering territories. They were defining the territories which were free, and they would construct communications to certain areas. They would look for investors. They were looking for investors all over Europe, all over the world. And when the investor was interested in investing into this area, and the land was transferred to public ownership. And they were trying to use this public land. But it was not just land. In many cases, the communalization of bankrupt smaller factories was taking place, and self-governance was looking for and finding investors for those factories which were going bankrupt and which were operating in the previous economic systems, but under new conditions they were unable to operate. And because the plants were transferred to self-governance, no one had to purchase the factories. The self-governance was contributing the factory into the joint venture, and the investor was making investments. These were small and medium-sized companies which were transferred to self-governance, and the self-governance was looking for partners for them, and they were contributing the property or land as the contribution to a joint venture with the investor who would invest new technologies, the access to markets, and was modernizing such factories, and were including them into the global economy.
Sometimes a huge narrowing of production took place, and maybe there was decrease in production, but the enterprise would find a chance for existence, and then the local administration had their own additional authority. They could be exempt from taxation for some time, and the investors were freed from their material contribution. There was a huge promotion and a huge intensive search for partners. So, of course, the reform of government did play a huge role in this, in restructurization. And, of course, the socialist enterprises, in spite of the apprehensions that I learned here in Ukraine, it is often said here that Ukraine would be a raw appendix or a supplier of cheap workforce for the West. But you know, when we opened to the West, the export of high technology export from Poland to West has actually grown compared to 1990, and it grown so manifold. And this is not to the markets of Soviet Union, but to the global market where we compete with many countries. I don't know how this is in translation, but I liked several important things that I would like to draw your additional attention to. Several times our Polish colleagues were speaking about cooperation, the cooperation between local and central authorities. Today in Ukraine, they usually juxtapose this, and they say that the central government is like bad, they take away everything, and the local government can be good, but they cannot do this. So I would like our Ukrainian experts to voice their opinion about how can we organize cooperation so that we have common effects. Another issue is, and I think it will be interesting for journalists, is decentralization. And of course, decentralization, as Mr. Wojciech said, decentralization is the decentralization of problems, not of the money. And why the authority is being transferred? Because the problems are better solved on local level. Yes, it's true. When we talk about the decentralization of power, we sometimes mean the transfer of authority to local self-government bodies. But this is not just one element of decentralization. I think there's a second element as far as coverage in mass media is concerned, is more important. This is delineation of authorities, distribution of authority between local self-government and the executive branch of power. And they start to tell now, let's liquidate district state administration, but we usually have two powers in place, especially on local level. So the reaction of people is, let's liquidate what is redundant, the state administration, so that we have only one body that is, for instance, called city council. This is very good as far as business is concerned, because business needs one power. But from the point of view of state management, this is nonsense. There can be such situation when there is no body of general jurisdiction. So I think that cooperation will begin when we have clearly defined authority. For instance, the local self-government body is responsible for fulfilling its obligations and gets money for it. The state bodies of power is like a perch who does not allow a crucian carp to sleep. However, they start to work only when the other fish is sleeping. But its task is the coordination of the departments on, so if we do this, then cooperation will start. Why? Because by definition, the bodies of local self-government, especially when they are elected for the first time, they make a lot of mistakes. So that they don't do this, there's a friendly advice from the bodies of executive power. This is not a pressure, do as I tell you. This is the principle of soft power. Don't do this because this runs contrary to the law. So when this will be understood, because in our mind space, everyone who comes to power thinks that everybody who is lower on the level is redundant and it should be suppressed. But there should not be higher or lower bodies of power in the country. And in this respect, a village head is equal to the president, because the president does not have the right to interfere into the work of the village head. For instance, instruct him to start the heating season, because this is the competence of local authority. So when this understanding comes, I will think that this is one of the indicators that the decentralization of power has started. I would like to add a Polish example how this all works. And Yuri said that the village head is equal to the president, but this is not the head or the headline, and this does not pertain to the entire range of authority. I remember in 2009, we stood in Krakow with a number of Ukrainian mayors who were talking to a speaker of the parliament, and he was asked how often the speaker calls mayors to him, and he says never. And how often do they meet each other? Well, 3-4 times a month at different conferences. Doesn't he summon them to tell them how to work? No, he doesn't. So how they work? Well, they meet at conferences and then they're being changed, they're replaced by at elections. There can be another headline. Who is easier replaced, president or village head? Of course, every day we feel different problems. For instance, the lack of hot water in the morning. Then you take your kid to the kindergarten and it's closed for some reason. I think that everyone will agree that when you feel problems every time, it is easier for you to change, to replace those who are closer to you. For instance, you are not satisfied with how they solve the problems, and you have more opportunities to replace them, not the officials of the state. This is one of the important accents in decentralization. The people who are engaged in this should be put as close as possible to people who are who feel these problems. This is the principle of subsidiarity in the European Convention, which Ukraine as if ratified, but unfortunately we have a different situation. Those who are solving the problems become farther and farther from the people. So the problem becomes chronic and then it explodes instead of calm realization of your right to mistakes. So, of course, there are people who haven't managed, and the community can easily replace them with those whom they think will manage. You don't have to go to Maidan, to Kiev in order to do this. I think this is what is easier changed. I think this is an entire philosophical thing that you should develop further. Why conduct decentralization? Because there's an opportunity to be faster in dismissing those who do not perform their power. There are several opinions. We had several opinions in the beginning of the Polish reform. The people who are now with me, next to me, were on the other side of barricades. I was a evil minister of finance, and those were representatives of local self-government. And we discussed, of course, the essence of the problem. I didn't have problems with local self-government, but there were problems with the departments of ministries. The great Polish writer Stanisław Jerzy Lec was writing sayings and utterances and aphorisms, and once he said, everyone wants your wealth, do not allow to take it away from you. So in the reform of self-government, it was like this. Everyone knew where the good for the people lies, and we will tell you how to reach it. Every decentralization is a game between the belief into the reason of local residents and the self-belief of administration that they are geniuses themselves. When people lose in the face of the geniality of administration, this is a disaster. I'll tell you now about mistakes of 1990. We did a lot of them, but if we had not started the reform for different reasons, we would start it in another 5 years in a more complicated situation. The right to mistake is not only the right of a local self-government, but also of the bodies that conduct the reform. This is a pressing urgent problem. We cannot wait until we know everything.
Here we are talking about the level of powiats and marszałki. Maybe Pan Grzegorz will explain to us how powiat, how community communicates with the district and regional level authorities, how influential they are, and how different level interests are coordinated to address the specific issues of specific people who live in specific territories. The Polish reform of self-governance was based on the distribution of powers, which were the powers of different levels of self-governance. That means that the community, the district, and the region within the sphere of their responsibilities could exercise these responsibilities independently, and there's no need to get these decisions approved with other levels of self-governance. And that is why we are not forced to cooperate. Such cooperation is naturally established, because it's clear that even though these are different levels of self-governance, but they are about same citizens who live in these territories, and every citizen of Poland is the member of community of district and region. And from the point of view of interests of that citizen, it is important for certain things to continue in the activities of a certain territory, like primary education. The education at the level of secondary school is the task of the community, and the community implements that independently. The higher education is at the level of the district, and that could happen separately, but if it's established, if it's defined that the foreign language is taught at the primary school and secondary school, then it's clear that the students have to continue learning foreign language at the level of the district, and children do not have to start learning new foreign language in the secondary school or in the high school. In practice, in the districts, once a month, there are meetings of executive bodies. The presidents of the municipalities or from the district, the head of the executive authorities, they meet together, they discuss common problems, and they discuss how they can coordinate the activities. And based on such cooperation, they can come to agreement, talking about the scale of the country. The situations are different. There are municipalities which are examples of very good cooperation. There are others where such cooperation does not function well. But once we are talking about self-governance, we need to take into account certain mistakes which will be there, because whenever we talk about functioning of this society, certain processes will lead to the problems in communication. That's natural in self-governance. We need to decisively understand that we need to get rid of this if something takes place in a different way, that is the only way it could be done, and everyone else should be doing it exactly the same way. We need to say that, okay, maybe someone will find some other way, some other method, not the one we are used to. Maybe this will be worse than what we suggest, or maybe it will be much better. That is very important, because if some communities are looking for their own solutions to the problems, then naturally they can compare and use the best practices. But if we force to use identical approaches on the territory of the whole country or in some region, we cannot say whether that is a good approach or bad approach. If in each territory we allow to look for the way out independently, then in some time we can define the best ones, and we can also find the worst. And they will be trying to use examples of the municipalities which are successful, or the best practices which are successful. This is like in the family. When children become independent, very often the parents believe that they know better what the child should be doing, but you need to allow a child to try and find own way, because in many cases this way is better choice than the choice made by parents. Thank you. Thank you. Small remark. When I became a convinced barrier of the USSR, when I was listening to the Voice of America, and they were quoting some pieces of letters of Levko Lukyanenko, and Levko Lukyanenko wrote that the Soviet Union has to collapse because that's like in a family. Some republics grew up enough to become independent, and they have to leave this family and start their own economy. So that is really very close to what you are saying. Pan Marcin wanted to add something. I would like to add also that to differentiate powers, we had to review 100 sectoral laws on roads, on environmental protection, on mobilization to the army, and any activity of the state appointing anyone to a position, creating a school, liquidating a school, school textbooks. Every action was to be defined, whether it's at what level of self-governance it is, or maybe it is under the state, the central government. For example, the school, who appoints the director, who appoints the salary, who can liquidate school, who can merge schools, who can create a new school, who approves new textbooks. All these things which are in the law on education, everything was to be clearly set, whether that's the community that is responsible for textbooks, for example, a road. The road is to be maintained, cleaned from snow, for example, repaired. You sometimes have to allow non-typical use of roads. Should that be done by the body under which this road is, or should it be done at the level of the central government? So all such responsibilities were distributed. What is under the owner of the road, or what is under the state? And we still have some discussions between different authorities when it comes to salaries for teachers, for example. And these are the disputes between self-governance and the government, central government. For example, the salary of a teacher. There is so-called card of a teacher, and self-government wants to be responsible for salaries of teachers, but now it's under central government. The local transportation payment for tickets, it's under the self-governance. Every community has its own tariffs, own tickets, and in every municipality they have their own system of payment for local transportation. But when it comes to parking sites, then the government sets how much could you charge for parking or the payment for waste disposal. The government does not set the rates, but it defines how should you form the rate for waste disposal. And the self-governance is against that. They want to set their own rates. But it is important that the powers do not contradict. Everything's clear. All laws distribute clearly. All public actions are defined. Who makes decision? If it's at the level of local governance, then they are responsible for their actions. But if someone takes a decision that some region will leave NATO or European Union, that will not correspond to the powers of that region, and the head of the region will stop this decision, and the court will decide whether that's within the powers of the local government or not.
To add to what Mr. Marcin said, there is a principle of presumption of competence in Polish legislation. If some authority is not defined by law for any other level of authority, then this is a automatical authority for the lowest level of power. When Mr. Martin was speaking, I remembered the decision of the Kharkiv regional council when they adopted in 2008 a decision that the territory of Kharkiv region should be declared the territory free from NATO, where the out-of-bloc principles of Ukrainian policy are realized. I cannot imagine how Voivodstvo would do this. But local authority, self-government is the realization of the right to mistake. For instance, they have elected some scoundrel ahead of the local council, and they are not taking out rubbish, what can be done in order to put the things to order. It is understood that such situation that Mr. Tkachuk quoted is theoretically possible. Luckily, we did not have such a situation in Poland, like happened, for instance, in Naples, where we knew from the television that they were not taking waste out. But in Poland, the activity is from the side of control, as the law is not performed. So the control about the responsibility to correspondence to legislation is done by interference into local authority, and crisis management is being introduced. And over 25 years, the crisis management was introduced like in 25 times, and this was done, it is being done until the next elections, and there's a representative of national authority that acts so that this activity is being performed. But of course, there's another possibility, like non-performance of functions. Then the administration of Voivodstvo has an opportunity to perform district authority at the expense of the district. We have two possibilities in Poland to do this. We didn't have many such cases, but there were several cases when such interference was done. There's another, of course, opportunity, the opportunity of local referendum to revoke the powers before their authority expires. and you should collect 10% of signatures of local population in order to conduct a local referendum, and then this will be held. In Poland, you held these referendums for two reasons. First, when the local self-government does not perform well, and also because of political reasons, when one faction provokes a referendum, and those referendums usually fail because people do feel when the referendum is needed and when it is not really needed. Of course, there are loud scandals in mass media, but you can probably count them on the fingers of one hand when such political scandals led to the change of powers. I would like also to emphasize two important moments for Ukraine, two important points. As Mr. Sventsitsky said, we have conducted the reform in two stages. The first stage was performed within the conditions of absolute comfort, which Ukraine now lacks, and the local administration was given the right to adopt decisions, and the communalization was going only in favor of communes because we did not have any other level of authority. And at the moment, the communities in Poland spend 75% of all the decentralized money. This cannot be done in the situation when all the levels are present. Of course, as Ukraine now has all the levels of authority, they will compete for money. We have another circumstance that you in Ukraine lack. We have got 2,500 communities, and we could accept them in the way they were, and even now they do fit the average size of local communities. For instance, in France, they have 35,000 communities, and France manages somehow. We cannot say that if France manages, then Ukraine will manage. But we did not have to conduct a territorial reform, and scandals are always linked to territorial reforms. Well, this is rather optimistic about the adventurism. I want to tell you that in our project, our draft law, we have used this approach that if a council initiates the early stopping of authorities of head of the council, then if this fails, then it is the council who has to resign. As far as the government commissioner is concerned, this is always out of the frame. Everyone who goes to Europe, everyone who studies other countries, they only learn about the protection of local authority. They do not learn how the state can preserve the situation when it becomes control the situation when it becomes rather problematic. Mr. Andrzej says that the first stage was rather comfortable because the former communist powers have lost their influence, while the new powers have not able to instill their authorities. At the moment in Ukraine, there's a lot of problems when regional powers, when, for instance, paramilitary groups become more and more powerful and want to snatch away from the central authorities as much as they can. I'd like to tell you that I am very much pleased with the draft law that you have developed that really does guarantee the situation that the major community in Ukraine is territorial community, and this is the norm that is there in Europe everywhere. I want to congratulate you on this. Of course, there's a situation that, for instance, the norm that a district is somehow higher on the level. I think that this does guarantee the situation when the community is the major unit. In Poland, we say that community is a major unit, but this is not realized. If you realize your principle, then there will be safe Ukraine, safe and secure, and you will be able to go away from centralized conditions. Mr. Anji says that we are choosing the right model, that the only subject of local administration is the community, and the regions and districts are the product of the realization of the right of community. This is very important for Ukraine in order to preserve the Ukrainian system, Ukrainian space, while there is a very serious decentralization. And I think here there is a problem. One of them is that when the changes to the constitution are adopted, those that will allow for the full-scale reform, this will allow very much to avoid the transitional period of some partial reforms. Will it be possible to conduct those changes before the local government elections that will take part in the autumn of the next year? This is what concerns us when we look close at the Ukrainian situation. And of course, there's a question of communities. In order to give these tasks to the communities, we have to think about money. 75% of our communities and the communities have not always enough population to perform all their authority. Is there political will to join some communities so that they have at least 3,000 to 4,000 people so that tasks can be given to them? I know that there is a law on voluntary joining of communities, but knowing the Polish experience, we know that there won't be much of voluntary joining. So my question to the Ukrainians is how you see the possibility before the next local elections to integrate communities into full-scale local communities. This, of course, does not mean that lesser communities won't have their right, their voice. For instance, in Poland, there are village councils that are not independent units, but they do perform some duties. For instance, some villages numbering 500 people can have their own self-government of sorts that would have lesser authority that they can realize independently. Is there a chance to integrate districts and communities in Ukraine? You have 490 districts in Ukraine. We think that this is too many. And what about Ukrainian experts? We don't have the answer. Maybe someone is doing this there in the parliament while they are agreeing the coalition agreement. and this is a political component. We have provided them with all that was dependent on us. And they will think more about this. Of course, if where it concerns decentralization, then if it is not distorted in the coalition agreement, where they want to, for instance, withdraw the mention of the concept confirmed, approved by the government, where the leader of the general jurisdiction body, like, for instance, the head of the state administration, is appointed by the president, but his appointment is initiated by the government, and they want to take this out. We know there's a draft that this should be the nomenclature of the president, which is nonsense from the point of view of administration, and we hear voices. Let's carry local elections in spring. This is a direct violation of the constitution, but this is very attractive for some politicians because they are probing how this will be accepted, viewed. But if we do this, then there won't be reform, of course, because we physically won't be able to adopt decisions necessary for this reform, because you need 2 sessions of the parliament to do this. We won't be physically able to adopt measures that would lead us to viable communities. It is possible to do this before autumn, but if those politicians who do not know zilch about what local government is, but they still take the rostrum, then there are huge dangers.
Yuri, we are talking like experts, and I would like to give the floor to politician Pavlo, who's an expert, and he will express his opinion, because we were talking about possible mistakes of local self-governance, and can people be re-elected quickly. Let's look at the local elections. What would be the good term of powers? And that's a question. It is important for how long should the head of the community be elected. That's important for our life. If in the beginning of this discussion we were talking that it is important to have consultations between central government and local governments, but the Association of Small Municipalities, we came up with the proposal which could be considered, and we need to think about introducing amendments to the Constitution. We suggested to include into the Constitution the local Congress to have the right of legislative initiative. This way, we would be able to have a mechanism of introducing proposals from local governments as to change of the existing rules of game in the country. On the other hand, we would get the necessity to for different levels of governments to be able to communicate. I believe in Poland also there's some conflict between these different levels of power. There always are some conflicts of interest between the local authorities of different levels. Such things will intensify the dialogue between the central government and local governments. I'm talking about the time frame for reforms, and I support Mr. Tkachuk. I believe those who are talking about elections in spring No, sorry, Yuri mentioned that. If we are talking about elections in spring, that would mean that we will have no reform. Do we want changes in our life? Do we want the powers to be transferred to local communities? Then we have to get ready for that. And the preparation should be at a quality that Mr. Martin said. We need to very qualitatively distribute the powers. One thing is to announce that we will live from tomorrow according to different rules, but it's important to set the rules. Each soldier has to know his actions, because otherwise we will have the situation of chaos and no one will know what they are responsible for. And also, as a practitioner, I would like to suggest to the organizers of this roundtable the following. Very often I attend roundtables where people get together who think alike. That needs to be done. And 99% we know that how we should be doing things. But it would be good to gather around one table people who are experts, who are practitioners in self-governance, to get people who want to have self-governance, and also to get people who believe that we do not need decentralization. And then we would have quite an interesting discussion with arguments, with proposals, and this way we will initiate the discussion in the society, wider society. And I believe as an expert or as politician, once we're talking about administrative territorial reform, my personal opinion is, and that's not the opinion of some associations, and it is that we can implement the administrative reform right now. The territorial reform can wait till 2015. There are things that could be implemented without introducing changes to constitution. And there are many things like that. Association of Ukrainian Municipalities has the list of these draft laws, the draft amendments to the resolutions of the Cabinet of Ministers, which will lead to real decentralization without amendments to Constitution, but not a single proposal was implemented. We heard, let's wait, we will have a reform, so that's what it is. I will give a couple of comments. If we gather those who are for and those who are against, then this will not be a round table. Those who are against, it's difficult to find because they are not public. They are whispering, and they are not saying that in public, but saying that we agree to everything. No, I do not support the idea that the Congress of Local Authorities should have the right to make legislative initiatives. And this is first thing that is something that doesn't exist anywhere, and then we force the local authorities to create such a structure as Congress. We limit their autonomy, and also we prepare the draft amendments and we submit them without the government, without the president. That would hamper the relations. So it's better to discuss all these things. It's better to look for the compromise and to come up with the common project. And I would like to add that in Poland, we were trying to include everything into the constitution, but that's not a very good approach. But we in Poland were working on the approaches which included not into the constitution but into the law. There's a joint commission of the government and territorial governments set up. Such commission has plenary meetings once a month, and we discuss all governmental draft laws and all draft resolutions passed by the ministries. And such commission does not give their approval, but we manage to approve 95% of things. But if we argue, we state it. If we argue over the draft law, then the draft law goes to the Verkhovna Rada, and then there's the information that the government and local governments think differently, and then the MPs make their own decision. And two more brief issues. First, it's distribution to local government and self-governance. The powers are to be clearly differentiated. But it is important for citizens also to understand these things. At the level of legislation, we will distribute powers correctly. That's one thing. But the citizens should understand that the local government is on this territory, and we need not just to clearly differentiate between local authorities and local government, but we need to not to avoid creating double authorities, because the citizens do not know all the laws in accordance with which the powers are distributed. That is one thing. And another thing is the time frame for reforms. And one more thing. If local self-governance would be launched when so that it operates under the budget that they did not approve, then this is the situation when there will be many problems for self-governance, and in the future also people will not perceive such self-governance well. So we are approaching to the end, and my proposal is say in one sentence something that you believe is worth mentioning, but just one sentence. Marcin? One sentence. Polish reforms and the reform of self-governance and the economic reforms of the beginning of the 90s were successful because one person was responsible for them, and such person was just responsible for that. Professor Regulski was responsible for the reform of self-governance. He wasn't the minister, he was the deputy minister. He prepared it all, he presented it to the government, and the government approved it and recommended to the parliament to approve. The same was happening with economic reform. There were many economists, many ministers, but one was responsible for economic program, Balcerowicz. And he made decisions what will be included into the program, what will not. So it is important to have one person who will be responsible. Such person should cooperate with many people, should listen to many, participate in many meetings and discussions, but someone has to present the draft reform of self-governance. Either the government entrusts it on this person. In Poland, we had big synergy between these experts because both Balcerowicz and Regulski were not politicians, they were experts who were preparing what the government should be doing. So between the experts, between the government and the parliament who signed, and public opinion that was waiting for that was the synergy. And I believe Ukraine has the chance to get such a synergy, and I'm very optimistic that you will succeed in that, because there's a big potential of such synergy. To sum it up, one comment, one advice. From the point of view of comments that we've heard, let us remember that the temporary decisions are the most sustainable. We cannot make a final decision. The best example is Poland, where reform of self-governance was divided into several years. First, there were communities, then districts, and then regions. But talking about search for a certain stage of reforms, you cannot introduce changes which will lead to self-governance, which will be just called self-governance. The best example is what Professor Misyong said. If we have self-governance which has to operate within the budget, which wasn't approved by them but was imposed from a side, that will not be self-governance. So if we are looking for some limits of reforms which can be achieved, that should be such scope of reforms which will be certain type of unity. Maybe it will not cover all the reforms, but this should be one thing that could be operating for some period of time. Very short. I would like to say that it is important in those approaches which are provisional approaches to say that that is provisional, that just for 2015, for 1 year. In Polish example, we extended this terms time frame when we failed to develop some resolution, and it would be extended for another year, but everyone knew that that is a piece of legislation for some period of time. And I will try to be even shorter. I believe that first you need to believe into the wisdom of citizens, and then don't delay with reforms, implement the reform now, and then work on it additionally. Because if we do not do that, we will not know where there are good approaches or where there are bad approaches. We have very good cooperation of experts. I would like to thank you for that. And I would like to thank Ukrainian Crisis Media Center for organizing this roundtable. And in the end, I would like to say that I believe that we had a good discussion. We've mentioned many interesting ideas, but one of great persons in the end of the 60s, beginning of 70s. Most young people do not know this person, but he said, if you want to learn how to swim, you have to swim. And all Chinese people started swimming, and now we have so many champions in swimming from China. So our colleagues are right when saying to implement the reform, you have to start it. So this is the end of just discussions, and we need to start doing it. Thank you, and in a few minutes we will have another brief.